Thank you very much, Peter. I will just quickly share my screen to get the PowerPoint. There we go. I hope you can all see that okay. So the output of this project to date has been largely focused on two particular case studies, which demonstrate the value of certain aspects of digital humanities when applied to even well-established and frequently used source materials on the 30 Years' War. The first of these case studies was a visual representation of garrisons at the time of the Peace of Westphalia, which Kate will talk about in more detail later on. Whilst the second case study looks to highlight the dynamic nature of the Little War angle of the conflict. For this second case study, we needed to select a suitable snapshot of the war, which would allow us to evaluate the local impact of troop movements and the presence of concentrated forces. In doing so, this case study would provide an insight into the effects on local communities of small-scale skirmishes, raiding parties, as well as determine the amounts of money, foodstuffs, and other resources demanded and extracted by occupying forces. By representing such actions, we can provide a more realistically fluid depiction of the interaction of even the largest armies of the 30 Years' War with the physical and human geography through which they moved. For our second case study, we selected the region of Franconia between May and November 1632. In this 6-month period, the territory endured anti-Habsburg forces advancing from the west and south, and the movement of Imperial and Bavarian troops from the east. These movements all culminated in the Siege of Nuremberg from mid-July 1632, which ended 2 months later with the Battle of Alta Vesta. The case study also covers the aftermath of the battle, with the division of both the anti- and pro-Habsburg forces in almost every direction before they moved north, ready to meet again at the Battle of Lutzen near Leipzig on the 16th of November. We wanted to accurately establish and track the size and location of military forces as they moved across Franconia, as well as record as many Kleinkrieg actions like raids and skirmishes as possible. Through the creation of detailed maps of the physical geography based on contemporary cartography and modern-day topography, we would be able to more accurately plot the movement of armies and produce a more comprehensive assessment of the impact of unit size and terrain on the speed of a force's movement. Likewise, we intend to produce a more accurate assessment of a force's impact on local communities by combining recorded contribution demands and thefts from civilian populations with detailed data of an army's size and situation, such as time of year, the duration of their presence, and whether they were in friendly or hostile territory. However, the suitability of a case study inevitably depends on the availability and quality of the data. The Nuremberg/Alta Vesta campaign features in military histories of the conflict, and we were able to use such works as a starting point for mining data in spite of some significant limitations. For example, one such work which acted as a key starting point was William Guthrie's 2-volume operational history of the 30 Years' War. As it primarily focuses on the battles themselves, the work provides only a brief description of the troop movements leading up to the battles of Alta Vesta and Lutzen, and also provides details on unit strengths which were in some cases more than a decade out of date. Nevertheless, Guthrie's detailed list of units present at Alta Vesta was still a valuable starting point in establishing the size of the pro- and anti-Habsburg forces. This data was then expanded upon with the evidence of various army lists. By using Georg Tessin's list of regiments raised by European powers in the early modern period, we were able to identify all regiments of combatants which were in existence in 1632. However, to then establish the size and location of these units in the time frame of our case study, we turned to contemporary records especially the several army lists for 1632, reproduced in the Swedish General Staff publications, as well as compilations such as the Documenta Bohemica. We relied on a range of primary sources for details regarding the movement and location of forces and specific units. By combining the evidence of the Swedish War Diary, also known as the Journal of Gustav Adolf, with descriptions of the Alta Vesta campaign contained in news books like the Swedish Intelligencer and contemporary memoirs, we were able to piece together the routes taken to and from Nuremberg by the pro and anti-Habsburg units as they traversed Franconia. Such sources also allowed the reconstruction of a detailed timeline of where various forces and units were on particular dates. With regards to the small war aspect of the project, data on the location of skirmishes and raids, casualties, and the extent of damage and theft of property, as well as information about allegiance and the base of soldiers involved, can all be gleaned from various other sources. However, local studies or works which adopt a more microscopic approach to larger campaigns contain more in-depth details about the impact of soldiers' presence on local communities. For our case study in particular, the first volume of Franz von Soden's Gustav Adolf und sein Heer in Süddeutschland provided details of the effects of a prolonged military presence in Nuremberg on the city itself. And this text also lists the vast quantities of bread, flour, oats, meat, beer, and wine demanded by and received by various Swedish contingents from numerous Franconian settlements and territories. However, in spite of the rich selection of sources from which we've been able to extract data for this project, there are also some limitations to the data for which we've had to develop working solutions. One such difficulty comes from the somewhat patchy evidence of primary source materials. In particular, with regard to dates, we've encountered instances where a source has used vague terms like around this time, or where the same source has actually contradicted itself, such as the Swedish Intelligencer claiming that on one particular date, Gustavus Adolphus was in two locations over 140 kilometers apart. Such a contradiction required us to compare this data with that from other sources and make decisions to prioritize the evidence of one over the other. Such decisions have been a frequent occurrence over the course of researching this case study, and we almost always favor the evidence of the most contemporary source. Another area of discussion that we've had over the course of the project was regarding the classification of certain units, how to record their presence, and how they should be represented visually. For example, should the forces of the Catholic League who fought alongside the imperial troops be recorded as one collected actor, or should the units raised for the League by Bavaria, Cologne, and Würzburg be assigned different identification codes based on their place of origin? We needed to consider how such distinctions could be represented whilst accurately displaying the composite and multinational nature of early modern armies, especially for a modern audience, which overwhelmingly regards armies as institutions of distinct states. We also discussed how to reconcile specific actor classifications with the evidence of primary source materials, which tended not to distinguish between Swedish troops and the handful of units from Saxe-Weimar or Hesse-Kassel, which formed part of Gustavus Adolphus's composite army. Another difficulty with the available data relates to unit strengths and presence in skirmishes or other smaller actions. Sources will often report such events as having involved some companies, or give a number of companies involved without detailing the number of men. This required us to determine an approximate average strength for companies of infantry, cavalry, and dragoons to use when the available data does not specify the number of soldiers in a specific force or action. After some discussion, we decided to use Felix Konzer's averages for imperial units from 1633, which he calculated by dividing the number of infantry, cavalry, and dragoon troops by the numbers of companies of each. And we then adopted a similar approach towards calculating averages for the anti-Habsburg forces based on the numbers of men and companies provided by contemporary Swedish army lists for 1632. However, a particular advantage to the way we record our data over the course of this project is that it allows us to repeatedly go back and make amendments as new findings emerge or as our pool of data expands. And at this point, I would like to hand over to Kate to talk about the more technical aspect of the mapping for this project.